How are you?
Good morning, participants. I would like to welcome you to the launch of the second edition of the Local Biodiversity Outlook. So I'll wait 1 or 2 minutes to allow everybody to join us. And then we will open the meeting. So I'll wait 2 minutes. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is John Scott, and I'm the Senior Program Officer for the Peoples and Biodiversity Unit, and also the focal point for Indigenous peoples and local communities at the Convention on Biodiversity. So it gives me a great pleasure to welcome you all here today for the launch of the second edition of the Local Biodiversity Outlook. So distinguished participants, I'd like to open this meeting officially. So ladies and gentlemen, I invite you to the launch of the second edition of the Local Biodiversity Outlook today, in conjunction with yesterday's launch of LBO 5. So the Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biodiversity in Decisions 1329 and 1435 requested the preparation of the second edition of the Local Biodiversity Outlooks, titled Indigenous Peoples and Local Communities, Contributions to the Implementation of the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011-2020. So LBO2 complements the fifth edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook 5 by providing many local initiatives being led by Indigenous peoples and local communities that demonstrate the power of collective and local actions for biodiversity. Through these actions, Indigenous peoples and local communities have made significant contributions to the successful implementation of the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity that ends this year. So LBO2 also outlines Indigenous peoples and local communities' aspirations and ambitions under the global biodiversity framework that is being developed. So this event will include remarks by the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biodiversity, statements from leading Indigenous and local community authors of LBO2, with local cases featured in the publication. And the first session includes, of course, welcoming remarks by our Executive Secretary, Ms. Elizabeth Maramba Marema, Executive Secretary of the Convention, and then three brief presentations by Ms. Joji Carino, the lead author of LBO2, Mr. Ramiro Batsin, the co-chair of the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, and Ms. Brenda Asuncion from the Kuanana Ulu Anamo in Hawaii. So this will be followed by a question and answer session, and then there will be a second panel. The second panel will be composed of four presentations. The first one by Mr. Rodium Sulaziga from the Center for Support of Indigenous Peoples of the North, Russia. Also Ms. Josefa Tully from the Philippines, representing the Global Youth Biodiversity Network. And Ms. Milka Chekolkea, excuse my pronunciation, from the Sengwe people, Kenya. And of course, Mr. Eduardo Brondazero, the co-chair of the IPAS Global Assessment on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So, and this will be followed by some concluding remarks by Maurizio Ferran-Ferrari, who is the second lead author of LBO. So now that I've outlined this morning's proceedings over the next 90 minutes, it gives me great pleasure to now give the floor to the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biodiversity to provide her welcoming remarks. Elizabeth, you have the floor. Thank you.
Hope you can hear me.
It's good.
Thank you. Distinguished representatives of the world's Indigenous peoples and local communities, dear friends and all participants, given the nature of this event, and as is the practice among the Indigenous peoples, I would like to respectively acknowledge the Kanian Kehaka people of the Flint, the Mohawk people. Greetings from the traditional territory of the Mohawk people, a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchanges among nations. I'm very pleased to be with you for the launch of the second edition of the Local Biodiversity Outlooks. The second edition of the Local Biodiversity Outlooks complements the fifth edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook with stories from diverse Indigenous and local communities, all contributing to the objectives of the Convention on Biological Diversity. LBO2 is published at a critical time. The assessment on the implementation of the 2011-2020 Strategic Plan for Biodiversity and a critical time for the negotiations of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. The Outlook provides several concrete examples of the interlinkages between culture and nature, sustainable land use, diverse traditional food systems, and sustainable consumption and production, as well as Indigenous peoples and local communities' perspectives and aspirations on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. It demonstrates the contributions of Indigenous peoples and local communities on each target of the 2011-2020 Strategic Plan for Biodiversity. It gives voice to those people living directly in and as part of nature. As such, it provides a valuable source of to the ground truth and to what is going on at local level at the interface of conservation and sustainable use. LBO2 comes at a time of a global pandemic that serves to demonstrate the overwhelming impact of our imprint on nature and what it has had, leading to the kind of conditions in which new diseases emerge, co-evolved, and spread. LBO2 reminds us that the emerging global biodiversity framework is a tremendous opportunity to reinforce the connection between nature and our health. It highlights the importance of traditional knowledge to protect nature's essential contributions to peoples, which include, among other benefits, a healthy and sustainable environment, as well as food security through access to traditional foods and medicines. At a time when GBO5 reports that most of the targets of the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity have not been met, and that the ongoing ecological destruction of the planet continues, it is important to seek out the optimism that is embedded by those who live closely with nature. The Local Biodiversity Outlook, furthermore, embodies an optimism that the destruction of nature and the drastic loss of biodiversity can be successfully reversed by embracing the values and building on the collective and local actions and the world's Indigenous peoples and local communities. Furthermore, the Outlook highlights that Indigenous peoples and local communities are protecting culture and nature. Their way of life embody the 2050 vision of humanity living in harmony with nature. As such, they have much to teach us, and we should learn. The systemic and the interrelated problems before us call for joined-up solutions and not business as usual approaches, challenging humanity to urgently envisage and renew our social and cultural relationship with each other and with nature. As humanity seeks out new ways of being and a sustainable future on this planet, now more than ever, it is time to bring the diverse knowledge systems together. The traditional knowledge of the Indigenous peoples and local communities, together with science as the best possible knowledge base for managing local ecosystems and addressing multiple crises before us. As partners in the implementation of the Convention, Indigenous peoples and local communities will play a fundamental role in addressing solutions in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. The many stories in the Local Biodiversity Outlooks encourage me to call on parties and governments and the international community at large to unleash the power of the collective and local actions of the indigenous peoples and local communities to assist humanity to achieve our vision of living in harmony with nature by 2050. I therefore welcome the findings and recommendations made in the Local Biodiversity Outlook, and I hope it will help us all to further strengthen their role in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Thank you very much, and I applaud you, the Indigenous people and local communities, leading us on this outlook. Thank you.
Mouse isn't working. Okay, sorry, we're having a few technical problems with our mouse. I want to warmly thank Elizabeth, not only for addressing us this morning, but for her deep personal commitment to Indigenous peoples and local communities. I also wanted to mention that at the end we'll be joined by the chair of Substa, Mr. Ezequiel Benitez Diaz, who really wanted to join us this morning. So we will give him an opportunity to speak at the end today, and he's very much welcome. So we look forward to hearing words from him. So thank you, Elizabeth, for your kind words and your encouraging words. Now, before proceeding with the presentation of LBO2, I would like to provide some information about how to use the platform and the use of the chat box for submitting questions. As we all know, we're learning to work electronically these days, so it's something we can all learn together in the next few months during this pandemic. So on this platform, you'll see on the right of the screen, you'll find a chat box where you can write your questions for the speakers. So please indicate the name of the speaker, the presenter, that your question is directed to. For your information, this session has Spanish and Russian interpretation, and you may choose the language of your choice by clicking on the button at the top of your screen to get translation into a language. Many of us are using these virtual platforms for the first time, so please bear with us if there's any little technical difficulties. I'm sure this is going to be a most successful event and something we've been preparing for quite some time now. So distinguished delegates, I would now like to give the floor to the first presenter on our first panel, and that is Ms. Joji Carino, and she will provide some framing remarks for the second edition of the Local Biodiversity Outlook on behalf of the lead authors of the report, and that's Joji and Maurizio Ferreri, of course, who will speak later. Now, Joji has been an active campaigner and advocate over the past 35 years on Indigenous peoples and human rights at national, international, and international levels. I can attest to that because I think I first met Joji in Geneva in 1993. So she is a senior policy advisor for the Forest Peoples Program and is a leader in Indigenous processes covering biodiversity, Indigenous knowledge, and sustainable development. She strongly supports community-based research and monitoring, and also coordinates a network of centres of distinction on Indigenous and local knowledge. So Joji, you're very welcome this morning, and you have the floor. Thank you. Okay.
It's evening here. So good evening to everyone. Good morning for friends in Montreal. I'll have a short presentation to frame the start of our discussions today. Can I ask the Secretariat, please, to share the PowerPoint presentation? Can we put it in full screen mode rather than the notes page? Okay. Local Biodiversity Outlooks was first launched during COP13 in Mexico in 2016 as a complementary publication to GBO4. Parties welcomed this report and requested that a second edition be prepared to accompany GBO5. I think that was a momentous decision by the parties in the partnership that has been maturing inside the CBD. Since then, working on LBO has become an important undertaking for Indigenous peoples and local communities in our engagement with the whole of the CBD, with parties, secretariat, scientists, civil society, and many other actors. Next slide, please. I therefore wish to give thanks to all our collaborators and donors who have enabled the preparation, launch, and dissemination of LBO2. LBO2 is a joint publication of the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, the International Women's Biodiversity Network, Centers of Distinction on Indigenous and Local Knowledge, the Forest Peoples Program, and the Secretariat of the CBD. Our donors include the Secretariat of the CBD, the governments of Japan, United Kingdom and Northern Ireland, Finland, Sweden, and France, and also the Torres Strait Regional Authority in Australia, and NIATERO, the Christensen Fund, Ford Foundation, and the Assembly of First Nations. Thank you very much for your support. Next slide, please. Yesterday, at the official launch of GBO5, we heard about the global state of biodiversity, headlining that none of the 20 Aichi biodiversity targets has been fully met. It is an alarming story, identifying specific failures within our political, economic, technological, health, and cultural systems, which have extracted far too much from nature, leaving the Earth's biosphere damaged and weak. Today, we will hear stories highlighting other facets of the biodiversity story. This focus on local biodiversity and stories of resilience, from speakers giving voice to the pains of Mother Nature as her children and healers, Indigenous peoples and local communities who are actively working with biological diversity, genes, species, and ecosystems as food and medicine, as our relations, and as our homelands. These voices are often quiet and unheard, and when loudly voiced, have been violently suppressed or silenced, as evidenced by the increasing number of Indigenous human rights and environmental defenders being killed. LBO2 is dedicated to these heroes. Next slide, please. LBO2 highlights over 50 stories by Indigenous and local community authors from around the world, presenting their perspectives and experiences on the current social ecological crisis. Each story speaks to a vision and a commitment for building a better future driven by solidarity and collective actions to overcome current problems. Next slide, please. Through these voices, Local Biodiversity Outlooks proposes 6 transitions necessary for the survival of IPLCs and for the health of people and planet. These are transitions on land, food, culture, governance, economies, and incentives and finance. And I will expand on this later. So what are some of the findings and lessons contained in LBO2? Next slide, please. Similar to most targets under the current strategic plan for biodiversity, Aichi Biodiversity Target 18, relating to traditional knowledge and customary sustainable use, has not been met, despite local collective actions by IPLCs. Only 10% of parties have reported including IPLCs in their national biodiversity strategies and action plans. And reporting has been piecemeal, focused on projects and activities. And the adopted indicators on traditional knowledge have not been used. Ongoing disregard of IPLC's vital contributions to biodiversity conservation, restoration, and sustainable use has been a major missed opportunity in the past decade. This neglect has affected the underachievement of all the 20 Aichi biodiversity targets. So putting the cultures and rights of indigenous peoples and local communities at the heart of the 2050 biodiversity strategy would deliver sustainable livelihoods and well-being and positive outcomes for biodiversity and climate. This is strongly supported by evidence that IPLCs conserve, sustainably use, and manage biodiversity as a reciprocal relationship of peoples contributing to nature. Next slide, please. LBO's second message is that overcoming separation and imbalances in the relationships between humans and nature is central to addressing the biodiversity and health crisis, including the rise of pandemics like COVID-19. Sustained partnerships are needed between sciences and indigenous and local knowledge to solve contemporary problems with holism and reciprocity. Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing inspire and evoke new narratives and visions of culture and nature working together within a living and sacred earth. Next slide, please. So Local Biodiversity Outlooks proposes 6 critical transitions in the coming decade. Land, towards securing land rights and customary land tenure of indigenous peoples and local communities. Food, revitalizing indigenous and local food systems. Culture, recognizing and respecting diverse ways of knowing and doing. Governance, inclusive decision-making and self-determined development. Economies, sustainable use of resources and the flourishing of diverse local economies. Incentives and finance, rewarding effective indigenous solutions and stop financing destruction. These are intergenerational visions, honoring the historical struggles and wisdom of past generations, drawing from the experience and innovations of today's living generations, and embodying the legacy and hopes for future generations. They contribute to humanity's joint endeavor to save our common home. Friends, our other authors and speakers present today will give substance to these compelling stories. Thank you for your attention.
Joji, thank you for giving us a very good overview and framing the conversation today. It's a great pleasure to welcome you as the first speaker. And now we're going to continue to move on because it gives me great pleasure to invite Mr. Romero Batsian, to take the floor. And Romero is well known to many of us, of course. He is a Maya Quequechel Executive Director of XIII, which is an indigenous organization in Guatemala in Latin America. He is also the co-chair of the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, which is an indigenous advisory group recognized by the CBD COP. He is also an Indigenous representative on the National Council on Climate Change and a member of the Guatemalan Indigenous Roundtable on Climate Change. He is also a member of the Central American Indigenous Council and the focal point for traditional knowledge in Guatemala for the Convention on Biodiversity. And he is a member of the IUCN World Council and, of course, an expert consultant on natural resources and Indigenous peoples. Ramiro has been a wonderful support to us in channeling Indigenous voices into the convention, and it gives me a great pleasure now to give him the floor, and also to remind all the speakers to try and keep to about 5 minutes, as Joji kindly did. Thank you.
Thank you very much to each of you for this invitation. To begin with, I would like to thank you for the invitation to participate in representation of the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity. At the same time, I would like to give thanks to the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity, Elizabeth Maruma, to the authorities, brothers and sisters of the Round Table, and to the Forest People Programme for the excellent work done regarding the construction of these local biodiversity outlooks. At the same time, I'd also like to recall each of the men and women who have passed over to be with our ancestors as victims of this pandemic that we are facing today. In the Mayan calendar, today is the day called Bejelekeme, the day for the grandfathers who pass along the white roads of our villages, where they protect us from, where they protect our natural resources and our biodiversity too. This publication, which today has been launched, is a key instrument which shows the work and knowledge of the Indigenous peoples and what they contribute to the fulfillment of the objectives of the Convention on Biological Diversity. These are the same who inspire us and invite us to learn from the lessons and processes realized by these people. Each of the chapters contemplates the experiences, contributions, investigations and research and knowledge of different Indigenous wisdom and how these have contributed to the fulfillment of each of the 20 Aichi targets. In the LBO today we can read about the knowledge and experience just as we can with the observation of the Mayas from the Grandmother Moon and the Brunkas of the nature, the mosquitoes and the Gunas observe the sea, where it has been, where the processes of conservation and biodiversity have been key, how these processes show a link between cultural diversity and biological diversity, increasing resilience in the face of climate change. The LBAOs are constituted as one of the bases of the proposals and recommendations that Indigenous people propose for the post-2020 period. It's therefore important that all of us who are within this process analyse and contribute so that this can be reflected in the objectives and the targets and indicators which are building the agenda for post-2020. It's important to highlight that in the LBO2, we have also had the inclusion of the studies that the IFB has been preparing on traditional knowledge, use and management of biodiversity by the Indigenous people. These studies, which have been prepared and distributed thanks to the support of SWEDBio. The LBO will be an instrument so that the Indigenous people can strengthen their participation and impact, which is being supported partly by the Voluntary Fund, and for which we would like to thank countries such as Sweden, Norway, Japan, Canada, which have contributed to this, as well as international cooperation, among which Christensen Fund, SWEDBio, Nayatero, and others who have contributed to the promotion and the recognition of the rights of Indigenous people in this framework. In order that the 2050 vision can be successful, we have to take into account the contribution that the sectors have made. In our case, this has to be in line with the Indigenous Cosmovision, as we call it, which proposes the intrinsic relationship between Mother Nature, human beings, and the universe. the link that should exist between nature and culture is fundamental. And this is what the LBO show us. The post-2020 process should be based on a framework and a focus on rights, gender equality, and intergenerational equality as key components for progress. We have to see how cultures and how this can interrelate between young people, between children, and between elders and the wise. Today, more than ever, we have to vouch for a post-2020 plan which is more ambitious and sustainable. The COVID-19 pandemic is revealing the effects that have been caused on biodiversity, and it has shown us that all of us can change when we encounter an emergency. The fact that we've been able to close and bring together national economies in an effort to stop the spread of this virus, which was something inconceivable a few months ago, it also highlights examples of how in today's world, there are some actions that are taking place. For example, we can see cleaner water. We've seen sea life appearing in places where it never did. Skies that are cleaner and with less pollution. Without an ambitious and transformative action plan for the next 30 years, we are at risk of a biodiversity crisis which will affect Mother Nature, the universe, and ultimately human beings. For that reason, it's fundamental that we work together, bring together our ideas, our thoughts, and efforts to develop the Uçkas Klimal, or the good living for humanity and for our Indigenous peoples. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ramiro, for your remarks. It now gives me a great pleasure to give the floor to Brenda Asuncion, who will make a presentation on local food systems. So Brenda began volunteering with Heheya Fish Pond while studying marine biology, and then she joined the Ka'aene Ulu Animal KUA team in September 2013, and her primary kalena is to coordinate opportunities for local practitioners and to increase networks for restoration efforts. So I welcome Brenda and thank you for joining us today. Thank you.
Aloha. Mahalo nui to all the organizers and collaborators who made it possible for me to share a little bit during this launch. It's amazing to be included among the many powerful stories in the LBO2, and we recognize that there are many more compelling stories yet to be told. I bring with me today all the families and communities who work to care for our island home, past, present, and yet unborn. It's about 5 a.m. here, and as I sit at home, I know there are people already heading into the mountains to care for our native forest. There are farmers and fishers preparing for their day. And there are people preparing their morning ceremonies to welcome the rising sun. And these are the kinds of people who are truly represented in this report. The geographical isolation of the Hawaiian Islands fostered a culture of sovereignty, self-sufficiency, and sustainability, which our communities today are hungry for, and in many ways remembering the taste of, even prior to the upheaval that the COVID-19 pandemic has brought into our lives. What brings me to this work is the place that was just mentioned in my introduction, a center for me in many ways that has gifted me transformative years, He'eia Fish Pond. These aquaculture and mariculture systems are called Lokoi'a, and there once existed nearly 500 across our islands. Local are just one part of a complex socio-political and resource management system that historically fed a population in the islands nearly as large as today, except that today we import about 90% of our food. Although many local sites have been physically destroyed, I have the privilege to work with a network of 60 local being reawakened in generation. Our case study about local in the LBO2 falls within Target 7 about sustainable agriculture, aquaculture, and forestry. And this is within strategic goal B to reduce the direct pressures on biodiversity and promote sustained use. Importantly, many of the key recommendations in these areas are founded on the knowledge, customary tenure, and rights of Indigenous people and local communities. This is certainly true for local because these systems are ingenious, place-based practice that evolved over generations as our ancestors settled and cultivated these islands over the course of hundreds of years. Local were individually engineered and managed at the scale of their a traditional land division at the watershed scale. The revitalization of traditional food systems, such as local, is deeply linked to the revitalization of community cohesion, traditional land tenure, self-determination in care and use of biocultural resources. We witness this revitalize every time we work together, and we recognize this as a time of reawakening the knowledge that's embedded in the relationship between our people and our land. Today, the vision of our local practitioners combines Indigenous knowledge, small-scale operations, and local enterprise, and this combination is increasingly important future of Hawaii. These aspects can similarly inform a collective global approach to food and agricultural policy. Food sovereignty, sustainable agriculture, aquaculture, and forestry is entwined with and lifted up by the empowerment of Indigenous peoples and local communities. We're proud and grateful that these works of our ancestors and the work of our people today included in this global evidence is to support the movement, the kinds of changes and transitions that the report calls for. Thank you again. Mahalo nui.
Brenda, I want to thank you. Thank you so much for those remarks. As someone from northeastern Australia, as an Indigenous descendant, it's good to hear from saltwater people, and it's fascinating to hear about your work in Hawaii. That brings us to the end of our first panel, and so now I would like to take a break for questions. And I want to remind people of the instructions, and that is on the right of your screen, you will find a chat box where you can write your questions for the speakers. Please indicate the name of the presenter your question is directed to, and then your question. And then we will read out the question and pass it on to the presenter to respond to you. So I'll just stop for a moment while we collect some questions. Thank you. Okay, okay. Any questions coming? I'm having trouble with this mouse again and the press and the speaker button. Oh, okay, it's working. Any questions? Hey? Hello? Thank you. I'm still waiting a couple of minutes to give people some chance to put some questions in the chat room, and after which we will continue with the second panel. I see we have one question here for Brenda, and she was interested in the role of traditional aquaculture can play in Hawaii's, what? Sorry, in Hawaii's, sorry, let me start again, having some technical problems. Kevin Chang is asking a question, and Brenda, he would like to know about the role of traditional aquaculture can play in Hawaii in terms of community sustainability and feeding people. So over to you, Brenda, with that question. Thank you.
Can you hear me again?
Go ahead.
Thanks, Kevin, for the question. Well, some of the pictures that I chose to share highlighted the collaboration that was needed to build and manage those local systems. They were highly engineered, human-made food systems that required many hands to build and take care of. And today we're seeing that traditional value of community and collaboration is still playing itself out in our communities today, even though we have such different social structures and political structures and economic structures than when fish ponds were first used in the islands. So in that sense, even though fish ponds were about feeding people, they are also feeding the sense of community and building up those systems of cohesion again.
Thank you, Brenda, for that. We also have some other questions coming up. I'll just wait until we get a few questions, and then I'll pass them on to the appropriate presenter. We have a more general question, and that is, excuse me, Justin Kendrick is asking our panelists is if the COVID experience helps to show the importance of community integration in the local environment. Does it show the impact of destroying that relationship? So I'll just go through a couple of questions and then I'll hand over to the panelists. Mika Tan is asking the Forest Peoples program mentioned earlier in the chat box. It would be useful to look at the complementary synergies between GBO and LBO, and she would like to hear more about that. And of course, as we look at the two publications, we're certainly looking at the complementary main messages. I'm going to stop there and hand over to our presenters to respond to a couple of those questions. Thank you.
Yes, regarding the impact of COVID-19 and what that has shown us. For example, our friends in northern Thailand, who are currently doing a lot also of recovery of the food systems and have very strong food systems. They were actually sending food to indigenous who were in the cities and also to neighboring communities. So when the supply chains were breaking down and it wasn't easy to get access to food from supermarkets or from far away. Actually, it was the local food systems, the home gardens, and the rotational farms that was able to produce a lot of food. And these were collected and distributed to the communities and also to those in the city. So I think indeed, initially it was the separation of people with the environment that caused a lot of food problems. But it also highlighted that when you are actually working with producing your food locally, then it can actually address crises like the present COVID-19 crisis.
Thank you, Joji. Is there any other presenters that would like to respond to those questions before I read out the next set? Thank you.
Sí.
Yes, can you hear me okay? It's also important with regard to COVID that at the moment this pandemic has shown us the importance of the conservation of biodiversity, but also to recover and to see how we can apply traditional knowledge. I think that at the moment, it's in the times like this, it's fundamental that Indigenous people can develop that knowledge because it's giving us alternative solutions. For example, with everything to do with food security, Indigenous people have a basis there. They have the natural resources and they are contributing to the world by conserving these resources, but the pandemic is also restricting us. There are many difficulties that we're encountering. For example, restrictions that we're seeing are also enabling the destruction of biodiversity because Indigenous people can develop their livelihood and live out their livelihood. But we have to be at home. But we know as well that there are external leaks, if we could call them that, which are damaging that relationship. And we can see how the self-organized communities of the Indigenous peoples are contributing to helping fight against COVID. And on a national level, whether it's political or cultural, what we want to see is a recognition of this traditional knowledge. And here too, it would also be useful that the convention, when it comes to preparing their post-2020 plan, they should take into account this situation, that the pandemic is developing. And here we have to repeat that it's fundamental to understand the contributions that the Indigenous people are making. And that's why it's important that in this case, the indicators and targets are clear, quantitative, how Indigenous people are going to contribute and how these rights are going to be promoted and how that participation by female and male Indigenous people will be promoted. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramiro. I now have a question for Joji. And that is, how do you think that we could more deeply integrate and include IPLCs in the post-2020 process in light of the LBO findings? Over to you, Joji, for your thoughts on that.
I think the parties have become a lot more serious and committed about what needs to happen in the future. And the evidence is clearly showing that the previous way that the the strategy worked was that this was too confined within environmental ministries. And rather, what LBO is stressing is that we really need a whole society approach. In as much as GBO is also calling for a whole government approach across sectors, there is also the need for the whole society approach. And I think this is what is shown by Local Biodiversity Outlooks. Even when there has not been much outreach or interaction between government ministries and communities, the communities are already acting and are already very well informed about the priority and necessary actions to do in relation to food systems, in relation to education, for example, and in relation to restoration of what is clearly being destroyed very, very fast. So the other area that LBO has been showing is going even deeper than the indirect drivers into the fundamental values and relationships that we have with nature. Because for many, nature is still seen as something out there. While what we are saying is that no, we are nature and we are part of nature. Therefore, I think the transitions that are proposed in GBO 5, which are mainly changes in sectors and hoping that these various systems will work more closely together, like water and energy and forest or cities. I think that the main messages coming from the contributors goes deeper to the fundamental relationships that we have with nature. It starts with each of us, and it needs to be manifested in the way we relate to each other and in the way we work with and the way we live in nature. So I think they're extremely complementary.
Thank you, Jochi. I have one final question for Romero, and that is one of the participants, Kevin Chang, is interested in both how do you work on the transmission of traditional knowledge to future generations? How do you restore lost knowledge? And I recall we worked together on the knowledge repatriation guidelines. And the third part is what is the role of your communities in restoring specific forest species? So I'll give, you'll be our last response this morning before we move on to the next panelist. Thank you, Romero.
Well, thank you for the questions. First of all, the transmission, this transfer of knowledge takes place in an intergenerational manner. Here within the communities of Indigenous peoples, they're transferring their knowledge from one generation to the next. I've always said that we've been of an oral tradition, but we also have a whole system of writing. We have our own alphabets, our own grammar, where we have transferred. For example, the Mayans have a whole system that has been transferred of kind of hieroglyphs that allow us to send on information about our history, and we have this written down. We do this, we pass this knowledge on orally, that's very important, but we do have to strengthen the knowledge, in this case, of our grandfathers so that we can pass that information down to the future generation. We have to strengthen the identity and culture of our young people and our children so that they can transfer that knowledge onto the next generations. And it's also another aspect that we've been working with the Indigenous people is precisely access to technology. Systems have been changing. Beforehand, the way that our fathers and mothers educated us and trained us and passed on all of their knowledge was through experience. They took us to the mountains, they took us to the fields, we went to the cornfields, and that was where we learned. But now we have technology, we have telephones, we have iPads, computers. So I think we also have to find mechanisms there so that we can transfer knowledge using these systems that the young people are so immersed in today, and we can perhaps innovate these processes and strengthen our identity. What the communities are doing, for example, what we're developing in XIII are two things. We have a whole process of strengthening the knowledge about the selection of seeds in a traditional way. The wiser, older people know about the techniques, they know the mechanisms, systems, and there's a whole observation. For example, in the LBO, there are different adaptations of how the sowing takes place and how it follows the Mayan calendar. The Mayan calendar tells us when we should select the seeds, what date we should sow the trees, what date we should be pruning them and taking care of them and all the rest, and even what date we should be cutting them down. So this is something that has been occurring in a traditional manner. We've been developing nurseries, we've been developing a program for native species. We have a whole process for an in vitro laboratory, and Indigenous women are taking care of the germplasms and managing all of the processes involved with seeds. We also have laboratories for medicinal plants, and there is also a process to combat deforestation and to conserve degraded areas. So we have often got systems that are not very systematized, but it's something that we're working on, and we are implementing actions for all of the forest area in the volcanic area of Huacachiquel. And we'll have a whole integrated system of natural resources in Central America, which is supporting the conservation of forests, water, and biodiversity, and the strengthening of capacities for Indigenous people so that they, within their networks, can be recognized, acknowledged, and respected within these negotiations regarding climate change. Thank you.
Joji, thank you for sharing a wealth of experience and knowledge with us. I'm going to wrap up the questions. It's my unenviable duty to keep us to some kind of time frame, and it's very difficult when we have such interesting people and such interesting things to talk about. But having said that, I will now conclude the first session and thank our presenters, and I'm going to turn to our next set of panelists, and we have more diversity. The first one, of course, I've already introduced these people, but well known to many of us is Rodion Silianziga, and of course he is from the Center for Support of Indigenous Peoples of the North in Russia. We also have Miss Josefa Tully from the Philippines, from the Global Youth Network, and as we're talking about humanity's vision of living in harmony with nature by 2050, we need youth at the table. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing her perspectives. We also have Miss Milka Chokakere from the Sangwa people in Kenya, and Mr. Eduardo Brondesio, the co-chair of the IPAS Global Assessment on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And of course, towards the end, we will be joined by the chair of SUBSTA, who would like to say some words. So I will introduce our first speaker, of course, who is Rodion. And Rodion has decades of experience as an Indigenous leader in Russia, the far north, and as a founding director for the Center of Support for Indigenous Peoples of the North in 2000. He is also the first vice president of the Russian Association of Indigenous Peoples of the North, referred to as RIPON. And Rodion was involved in negotiations towards the adoption of the UN Declaration on Indigenous Peoples' Rights. And in 2019, Rodion is a member of the UN expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples, Emirates. So I'm very pleased to welcome an old friend and a long-term warrior for Indigenous peoples. Over to you, Rodion. Thank you. Rodion, do you have the microphone on? Thank you.
Do you hear me now?
That's good. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And it's almost 1 a.m. in my area, so good morning to everyone. My topic today will be sustainable development, climate change, and biodiversity, strong linkage. Distinguished panelists, dear participant, I'm honored to participate in the meeting dedicated to such a crucial and urgent matter. But firstly, I would like to congratulate CBD Secretariat, donors, and second Local Biodiversity Outlook leaders for the great report, and also thanks for the invitation to contribute to the global launch event today. Beyond difficult times, I believe it is wise to look at the pandemic as a major opportunity, since the issues of biodiversity, sustainable development, and climate change are now being discussed more than ever before. There is a great awareness of the impact of human activities on nature and of the connection between human health and biodiversity. And pandemic became a massive wake-up call for everyone, governments, business, and public. The biggest challenge and number one task for countries in the post-pandemic time will be economic recovery. And the greatest fear for us is how to ensure that this recovery will encapsulate the principles of sustainability, biodiversity, and green economy. And there is a still question, will the governments demonstrate ambitions and willpower to accelerate actions on biodiversity and follow-up mechanism? To succeed, we must reimagine the post-2020 agenda and include multiple actors, stakeholders with different interests, but shared goal of protecting the planet for future generations. 2020 will be known as a turning point for global biodiversity, for sure. Thus, it is a timely task to design a roadmap for multi-stakeholders partnership that simultaneously fosters economic development, empowers local actors, conserves indigenous knowledge, practices, innovation, and develops actionable plan. And of course, we must admit that the recovery of our planet so to succeed is critical to ensure empowerment and the full and effective participation of indigenous peoples in sustainable development of our homes. And I would like personally to believe that the loss of biodiversity is still preventable, but only with massive cooperation on global and local levels. Issues that COVID-19 brought forward, such as climate change crisis, are not new issues. Nevertheless, this year threw us off the guard. May this year be the year we assemble, we research, we direct, we get ready, and we take our marks. And the next year of 2021 will be the year of change, year of actions, year of the breakthrough. Pandemic is nothing but the crisis of mistreated environment. And although I believe that 2020 became a major opportunity and the so-called reset button in our relations with nature, it seems the last call. It has been and is still a time bomb. And 2021 will be our fight for the biggest chance to save the planet, our cultural and natural heritage. Launched today, the LBO2 is one of the responses that we have been looking forward to. It is a measure that will near us to the solution agenda led by at-risk indigenous communities and recover hidden and lost voices. It calls for immediate actions and hopefully will be the key initiative in protecting and restoring ecosystem and biodiversity and retaining control over what happens to the future generations. Thank you very much.
Rodian, thank you so much for your thoughts, and also, of course, for joining us at 1 a.m. your time. I hope you can stay with us for a little while and then get a good night's sleep, or what's left of the night. We're going to keep moving, and now I have a presentation, have the opportunity to give the floor to Josepha Tully to make her presentation on traditional knowledge and sustainable use. So Josepha, of course, is a Indigenous Ibaloi Kanay Igorot youth from the Cordillera in the Philippines. And she has a background in biocultural diversity conservation and grassroots initiatives with Indigenous youth. And she's an excellent representative of youth. So I'm very happy that you can join us today. Over to you, Josepha.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Tuwis ay agaw kanda kayo amin. My name is Josepha Tauli, and thank you for the opportunity to speak during the important launch of the second edition of the Local Biodiversity Outlooks. It's also a unique opportunity to be able to talk to you from the ancestral lands of the Ibaloi people. LBO2 very importantly brings to our attention the stories from the grassroots, the messages from the very heart of nature, from the forests and fields, where nature and culture mutually strengthen each other, giving rise to thriving ecosystems and to the vibrant knowledge that continues to sustain them. A few years back, as a young graduate student, I and a group of friends put together a series of workshops on environmental leadership for Indigenous youth, building skills that could be useful in leading environmental projects in their area. During these workshops, Indigenous high school students assessed what kinds of projects they felt were needed in their community and put together action plans that would make them a reality. And so at the end, we got to take a peek into the solutions that Indigenous youth had come up with for the very real environmental problems that they had wanted to solve in their community. I'm always proud to share that the results of this activity, the richness of ideas that came out, the leadership demonstrated, left us feeling very inspired. The ideas pitched include projects to safeguard the diversity of medicinal plants that they felt were in danger of being lost. Another group wrote a song in the Indigenous language on the dangers of climate change. And another group planned nature walks to build connections and awareness of young people with their rich biodiversity. These and many more innovative and well-planned ideas came up that were completely conceptualized by Indigenous youth and grounded in Indigenous values, traditional knowledge, and customary sustainable use. It is this simple activity that I'm proud to have contributed to the LBO2. Now, this is but one activity done by a few young people, but from it, we can learn that young people take our values wherever we go and in whatever we do. From connectedness to nature comes the drive to safeguard it. From valuing our natural and cultural heritage comes the drive to ensure that it is passed on. These are the things that, in the right environment, we learn in school and at home from our peers and our elders. Education is an incredibly important issue for young people. It is pivotal in shaping the way we think and act in this world. Through education, we can be pushed to think richly and creatively, taught to act with care and purpose, and inspired to learn from the wisdom of our elders. It is through education of many forms, that we can hope to inspire entire generations to dream up and act on new narratives, a new future that puts nature, well-being, and care for all well before power and profit for few. The Strategic Plan 2011 to 2020 puts awareness as IG Target 1. The target has not been achieved. We can do better for biodiversity awareness of the general public by acknowledging that awareness is not enough. In the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, we need to go deeper and more widely to instill in everyone the collective responsibility we hold to steward our planet. We must emphasize connections between people and nature, revitalize the diverse knowledge and resource management systems that are in danger of being lost. And we need to break silos, the silos that keep us from meaningful dialogue. We must support the traditional occupations that sustain generations of Indigenous and local knowledge, especially for youth. And we must ensure that our diverse educational systems integrate the values of biodiversity, but also of cultural diversity, sustainability, languages, human rights, and heritage, which are all inextricably linked to biodiversity. Now, coming to the present, the Global Youth Biodiversity Network has, through its capacity building initiatives throughout the years, been refining the way we talk about and teach biodiversity that gives justice to its complexity. Yes, biodiversity is species, ecosystems, and genes, but its loss is rooted in inequality, disregard for human rights, gender inequalities, and generational silos. Understanding of this complexity is the change we want to see in biodiversity education and in biodiversity policy, and we have collectively exerted efforts towards this ourselves. Education, we truly believe, is transformative. And so now, to the world's decision makers present, in this crucial time when all eyes are on you to change the course for biodiversity, the question we have is, will you follow our lead? Iyaman ka na kayo amin. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Josefa, thank you so much for joining us and for providing us with the views of youth. If we don't have youth at the table, we're not going to make it to 2050 and achieve our vision. It's extremely important that we listen to the voice of young people. Now I'd like to keep moving with our presentations this morning, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Miss Milka Chekkoria to make a presentation on the issue of conservation in nature. And Milka joined Natural Justice, which is a well-known NGO, started in Africa and of course is now international, she joined it in May 2020 as the Environmental Justice Fellow, and she comes from the Sengwa community in Kenya and worked for 5 years advocating for the recognition of their land rights. So Milka has a particular interest in how gender determines Indigenous people's interests to manage and sustainably use natural resources, and therefore the positions that are taken in decision-making processes. So it's good to have a strong gender perspective being presented today. And now I will give the microphone to Milka, and welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much for giving me the floor. I'm pleased to be part of this meeting to deliberate on very important issues, especially to us, the Indigenous communities. I would like to give special thanks to the CBD and the lead team behind the LBO2 for inviting me to speak about the experience of my community and those of Indigenous peoples in Africa and across the world with relation to conservation of biodiversity. The Sengwer is a forest Indigenous community from the Charangani Hills in the western part of Kenya, and we live in Kabulet Forest and Embobut Forest. Our ancestral lands were registered and gazetted as protected areas in the year 1994, without the knowledge and the consent of our forefathers. With this conservation paradigm, we have therefore been evicted from our ancestral lands since then, both by the colonial government and subsequently by the independent government of Kenya. These evictions have been characterized by burning down of homes and other belongings, leading to continuous resourcing of forest resources to rebuild homes over and over again. The recent evictions have happened during the pandemic, exposing the community members to more danger of contracting the virus. Worst of it is the experience of the children who have been home after schools have been closed. As we increasingly speak about the conservation of biodiversity, it is time to reflect on the strategies being implemented by conservation agencies, be they government agencies or international conservation organizations, that could lead to more loss of the same biodiversity through the denial of communities to live in and manage their territories. It is important for us to note that most of the biodiversity we all wish to conserve are in Indigenous peoples' territories. In our case, it is in our forests, and therefore securing our rights to such lands is the effective and sustainable way to conserve biodiversity. Continuous eviction leads to a continuous loss of the culture and traditions, which has been the enabling factor for our conservation way of life, and therefore loss of biodiversity, which has been consistent for years. Do we ever ask ourselves how much biodiversity is lost over a period of, say, 10 years of continuous evictions using fire just to keep communities off protected areas that they have been living in since time immemorial? What would it be like if such communities were left to care for their own lands? In reference to the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and the 30 by 30 target, I would highly recommend on behalf of my community and other communities that the target number 2 is aimed not only in increasing the number of protected areas, but rather just conservation of Indigenous and local communities. This will help in returning power and control to parties that value and care for biodiversity than leaving it to the hands of those who just want to exploit. Additionally, Target 1 on spatial planning, customary lands of Indigenous communities and local communities are a distinct land category that must be secured. This is also included in the Sustainable Development Goal number 1. We have it in our lands and have conserved the biodiversity for so long. It only helps if we are empowered to do more. And evictions just leads to more loss of biodiversity. Thank you so much.
Milka, thank you so much for talking to us today. I'll keep moving with our next speaker because we only have about 15 minutes left and we still need to hear from 3 speakers. But I will hand to our next panelist, who is the co-chair of the IPIS Global Assessment on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and that is Dr. Eduardo Brondizio. And Dr. Brondizio is a distinguished professor of anthropology in the Department of Anthropology at Indiana University in Bloomington, the US, and the director of the Center for the Analysis of Social Ecological Landscapes. So Eduardo has served as a co-chair for the IPIS Global Assessment on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and he is the co-editor-in-chief of the Current Opinions in Environmental Sustainability, and he is the member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Eduardo to the panel today and to remind us of the importance of the findings of the global assessment by IPIS. So having said that, Eduardo, you're most welcome. Please take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, John. It's an honor to be here. On behalf of the entire team of the IPBES Global Assessment, congratulations on the publication of the superb volume of LBO2. LBO1 itself was a landmark report that culminated from decades of investments of many of you, and you should be recognized for that. It was a fundamental contribution to the global assessment. The richness of LBA2 and the power of its message arrives, I believe, at a really critical moment. It's critical because not only there has never been so much recognition for the urgency of addressing the interconnections of nature, climate development together in the central role that IPLCs, Indigenous people and local communities, play in supporting society to achieve these larger roles. I think there's recognition as well that that role has to play vice versa. It's clear on our role in supporting Indigenous people and local communities in their rights. It's critical because there has never been so much denialism, lies, conspiracies, and disregard for facts in many important parts of the world. And there has never been as much vicious attacks on the rights and lands of Indigenous people and local communities, and the killings of Indigenous leaders in many parts of the world. All of this aggravated by the pandemic, as mentioned by Mr. Ramiro not long ago. So LBO2, as the global assessment, as GBO, and as other assessments, have a much broader mission to inform society with concrete examples that are played on the ground that can change and help the lives of people and society as a whole. It's time for us to recognize that. I particularly appreciate the voice of the youth and the attention to the youth in the LBO2 report. They show that advances have been stronger than setbacks, and they are the face of hope moving forward. The global assessment provides the most comprehensive and systematic analysis of trends in nature, its drivers, its consequences, and possible pathways forward to overcome the current challenges and crises towards the Sustainable Development Goals. We worked hard in collaboration with many of you and many others to carry out a systematic, multifaceted approach to incorporate, synthesize, and scale up the contributions of Indigenous people in local knowledge, practice, and innovations, and also the problems faced by Indigenous people in local communities. The findings of the global assessment closely reflect the voices of the three previous speakers and the messages of the Local Biodiversity Outlook 2. So to conclude, I wanted to highlight 3 points that resonate with the 3 messages that we just have heard. Mr. Sulazaika highlights the interdependence of biodiversity, climate, and development. Indeed, the global assessment shows that nature biodiversity decline, development inequalities, and climate are indivisible. They have mutual impacts and compound and exacerbate with each other with many unequal consequences around the world. Any discussion of adaptation and mitigation are interdependent on that connection between nature, biodiversity, development, and climate. And all the process to going forward have to approach those issues synergistically, as highlighted in many of the previous presenters. Second point, as highlighted by Mrs. Josefa Taule, on the importance of traditional knowledge in sustainable use and their innovations. Indeed, the global assessment shows that advances that we have made in achieving some of the international goals, or at least progress towards that, is in no small measure from the contributions of Indigenous people and local communities. While progress has been mixed and uneven across targets, such as Target 18, there has been many advances and progress in targets where local initiatives and by Indigenous people and local communities have contributed. And that includes in fisheries, agrobiodiversity, invasive species, protected areas, preventing extinctions, access and benefit sharing, and knowledge. In fact, I think in the Local Biodiversity Outlook shows that local initiatives have been the greatest protagonists of advances during the past decades. And I believe they'll continue to go forward as we slowly try to have changes that are broader and at a larger scale. Finally, I wanted to resonate the voice of Mrs. Chipikori. A new set of targets must rest on the recognition of the lands and territorial rights of Indigenous people and local communities. The GA shows, the global assessment shows globally that interconnection is very clear. 25% of the global area is managed, held by indigenous people and local communities as the stewards of that. That allows that 35% of the most conserved ecosystems on the planet are within these areas, as is 35% of protected areas. These are the areas where we have the least decline. But even that, the global assessment shows that over almost 500 indicators, we see decline in 72% of those indicators. These are local indicators used locally. Indeed, when we look forward to the new biodiversity targets, one of the most recent reports on doing scenarios for achieving and conserving 30% of the Earth's surface make it very clear. The overwhelming majority of such a goal, 60 to 90% depend on the region, and 80% on average, depend on the recognition and partnership with indigenous people and local communities. Our future intertwined in that sense. And that's the message of the GA. We need to recognize the knowledge, the innovations, the practices, the institutions, the values, and the struggles of indigenous people and local communities to work together to achieve the goals that we want. I'm going to come back to my initial point that we live in a time of contradictions. It's a very critical time. There's no time for silence in the face of denialism and violence. And we need to work together towards that. This is not a cause of indigenous people and local communities only. This is a societal cause. But we can build on the inspirations of the history of struggles and resilience of indigenous people and local communities as an inspiration for us to overcome this crisis towards a more sustainable and just future. Thank you.
Eduardo, thank you for a very powerful presentation, and you remind me on the issue of human rights, environmental defenders. The executive secretary 3 years ago quoted a figure of 4 people being killed a week, and this year when she spoke on environmental defenders, spoke of on average 4 people being killed a day. So these are critical times that we live in. Eduardo, that was very powerful, and coming after the others, we've had a very strong panel, but I'm going to hold off with questions because we're fast running out of time, because I would like to firstly, I'd like to give the floor to the chair of SBSTA, the SBSTA Bureau, Mr. Ezequiel Benitez Diaz. And then I would like to give the floor to the last speaker, Dr. Maurizio Ferran Ferrari, before we wrap up today. So I want to thank Ezequiel for joining us. He insisted on being here because he regarded this as extremely important, and we were pleased to make some space for him to address you. So welcome, Ezequiel. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, John. I hope you can hear me. It's an honor to be here on the presentation of LBO2. As Georgie mentioned, and also the last comments from Mauricio, GBO5 shows that we are dramatically losing biodiversity and that Aichi targets were not achieved. Certainly we are in depth with nature, and we must take appropriate actions right now. I do congratulate authors and all participants for presenting Local Biodiversity Outlook to both the summary conclusions and recommendations of 56 pages and the full text of 313 pages. I also congratulate CBD Secretariat for publishing LBO2 in all 6 UN languages at the web page, at the CBD web page. While GBO5 recognizes 8 transitions on forest, water, agriculture, food, cities, and health, LBO2 not only analyzes every Aichi goal and target, but it also proposes 6 transitions that I believe are nicely complementary to those transitions proposed in GBO5. Cultural, land, governance, incentives, economics, and food transitions are key to really make the transit that we need to live in harmony with nature. Dear friends, inclusiveness and human rights, as just mentioned before by previous speaker, are key conditions for a successful post-2020 global biodiversity framework. In particular, inclusiveness of youth, women, and indigenous peoples and local communities. Not only for attending CBD meetings, the most important part is acting and influencing in your territories all people around in implementing all three objectives of the CBD: conservation, sustainable use, and benefit sharing from access to genetic resources, and also Article AJ on traditional knowledge. And this has to be on the best possible conditions as described in the 6 transitions proposed. Finally, I invite you to participate actively at SABSTA 24 deliberations in order to provide elements for the monitoring framework of post-2020 and to find good indicators and baselines for indigenous and local knowledge, as well as to show indigenous peoples and local communities active participation in CBD. Thank you very much and congratulations.
Ezekiel, thank you for joining us today. As everybody knows, the SABSTA is our subsidiary body for scientific and technical advice, and more traditional knowledge is looked at as equal value to science, and we're looking at combining science and traditional knowledge, as Elizabeth said, as the best possible base for managing local ecosystems. So it was very important for us to have the chair of SABSTA here, and I'm very grateful that Ezekiel was able to address us. And now I bring to the cliche, last but not least, and he certainly is not least, he's been a wonderful support for Indigenous peoples for a lifetime, and that is Dr. Maurizio Ferrari, who has been researching and supporting action for the environment, human rights, and sustainable development at local, national, and global levels since the late 1980s. Yes, there were some people born before 1990, for those young people in the room. He has been with the Forest Peoples Program since 1997, and much of his work, indeed his life, has focused on supporting Indigenous peoples and local communities in the implementation of the convention at all levels. So Maurizio, my dear friend, it gives me great pleasure to hand the microphone to you to speak, and if we have a couple of minutes at the end, we can take some questions, and if you have some questions, please remember to put them in the text box. Over to you, Maurizio. Thank you.
Yeah, many thanks, John and everybody. As we are all learning to use these new platforms, could you just confirm that you can see me and you can hear me?
Very good. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Yeah, many thanks for giving me the opportunity to provide some concluding remarks. I feel really, truly very honored to do so, but also very humbled because I'm aware that a few minutes remarks cannot do justice to the richness of the voices and experiences of Indigenous peoples and local communities worldwide in their huge efforts to protect and sustainably use biodiversity and defend their lands and their rights. I would like to thank all the speakers and presenters in today's launch and the audience for their attention and their engagement through questions and comments. It is clear from the presentations today, as well as from the launch of the Global Biodiversity Outlook 5 yesterday, that we as a human family are at a crossroads. We can allow unprecedented biodiversity loss and rapidly accelerating climate change to continue, or we can challenge existing unsustainable systems and ourselves to find solutions to the worsening social ecological crisis. I'd like to offer 5 remarks. Firstly, on the close interaction between local and global levels. All the global reports on biodiversity, climate change, and sustainable development during the past few years call for transformational change in the next decade, so there is no time to waste, to put us on track towards a healthy planet and sustainable societies by 2050. While agreements and action at the global level are very important, the LBO2 case studies remind us that biodiversity is place located and that solutions to this global crisis need to be in place at all levels, from the local to national, regional and international levels. Activities and actions by indigenous peoples and local communities at the local level are therefore vital and essential in solving global challenges. Secondly, on the role of indigenous peoples and local communities in sustainable management and conservation of biodiversity. The IPBES Global Assessment of 2019 shows that much of the world's biodiversity is located on the lands of indigenous peoples and local communities. Approximately 35% of the global area that is formally protected and 35% of all the remaining terrestrial areas with very low human intervention and rich in biodiversity overlap with indigenous lands. When the lands of local communities are added, those percentages are even higher. Current estimates suggest that lands under the communal management of indigenous peoples and local communities range up to at least 50% of the world's land area, covering a wide range of biomes, including forests, rangelands, deserts, and coastal and marine areas. Recent studies, however, estimate that only about 10% of these lands are protected through collective land titles of indigenous peoples and local communities. Many of these areas have become islands of biodiversity surrounded by a sea of destruction and are under increasing pressures from land grabbing and unsustainable development. Urgent action is therefore needed to support indigenous peoples and local communities to protect their lands and their rights. Thirdly, on the importance of indigenous peoples and local communities' values and collective action. LBO shows that IPLCs have customarily been guided by principles and practices of mutual coexistence and reciprocity with nature, and they've been increasingly taking collective action towards the objectives of the Convention and all of the 20 Aichi biodiversity targets. The presentations today show also that IPLCs are taking those collective actions across generations and gender in a very inclusive way. In many cases, youth, women and men are working together at the forefront of those actions with great spirit of innovation, leading to restoration, conservation and sustainable use, while building on the indigenous and local knowledge and experiences transmitted from generation to generation. Other global initiatives documenting and supporting IPLC's collective actions, many of them mentioned in the report, are joined by many regional and national networks which are growing in strength. This is positive development which needs to be nurtured and supported. Fourthly, on the need to recognize and address challenges. The LBO highlights that the efforts of IPLCs are not sufficiently recognized by governments, and the vested interest driving biodiversity loss and human rights violation remain insufficiently addressed. This needs to urgently change, including through regulation, collaboration and partnerships to effectively address the real drivers of biodiversity loss, including unsustainable production and consumption patterns. A systemic transformation is needed, not just cosmetic fixes. Fifthly and lastly, IPLCs are vital actors in implementing solutions and show us some of the ways forward. These local efforts and experiences represent seeds of hope and seeds of change for a better future. They have a great potential to complement the efforts of many other social actors to effect the transformational change needed to progress towards the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. But they need fertile ground to grow and expand. The components proposed in the sixth transition that Georgie touched on at the beginning of today would provide an enabling environment for those positive experiences to flourish. This complements quite well the 8th transition expounded in the Global Biodiversity Outlook 5. Just as an example, the land and forest transition in GBO5 calls for the adoption of integrated approaches to land use and land use change with strong community engagement and supported by secure land tenure. One of the transitions put forward in LBO2 is a land transition based on securing land rights and customary land tenure of indigenous peoples and local communities. Considering that much of the world's biodiversity and more than 20% of carbon is stored on their lands and territories, securing their rights to land should be considered one of the most effective ways to make rapid progress towards biodiversity, climate change, and sustainable development goals. That would also address injustices committed against IPLCs and prevent conflict and human rights violations. It would also make good economic and financial sense as the most cost-effective and just pathway towards conservation and restoration. As my last call is on behalf of the author of this report, I would like to invite governments and all participants to seriously consider the contents of LBO2, including the recommendations and the transitions, in the forthcoming negotiations of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. IPLCs have shown time and again that they are fully committed to playing their role in the achievement of the objectives of the Convention. It is now vital that their roles, rights, and contributions are fully reflected in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Let us all make sure that the local seeds of hope and seeds of change being nurtured by IPLCs across the planet inspire all of us in our daily lives and actions to strive for a better future for our generations and those yet to be born. Many thanks to all those involved in supporting the production of LBO2, to all of you for participating in this launch, and to John for very kindly chairing it. Many thanks, John.
Maurizio, it's difficult to put into words to thank you and everybody else, because there would be no words that could thank you enough for. Actually, I look at all of the panelists and realize we have hundreds, actually thousands of years of experience if I count your elders. And sometimes working on the big picture, it does get very pessimistic. And of course, we're in the middle of a global pandemic. And when I get pessimistic, I look to what Indigenous peoples and local communities are doing at home and on the ground, so that I maintain some optimism. Certainly, Indigenous peoples and local communities need to be recognized as full partners in the implementation of the convention, and I hope that this LBO sends some very positive messages to the development and the negotiation of the post-2020 global biodiversity target. It's difficult to wrap up. Of course, Maurizio is the last speaker, but we do have some good questions. What I promised to do is my staff are making a record of these questions. We will send them to the presenters, and so that they can answer you and your valuable questions are not lost. So I apologize for not being able to take questions now because we're 15 minutes over, but I want to encourage you to send questions because our presenters will answer you and can open a dialogue with you, of course, if you have time to do that. So ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for your attention for GBO2. It's been a really good launch. It's an important complementary publication to GBO5. For me, it ground truths what's happening on the ground. It tells us what's really happening on the ground. And but before I wrap up, I want to thank my IT team. You don't know it, but we all came into the office today to make sure we didn't make any mistakes. So we have Lisa and Randy and Blaze and Nancy and Vince and probably other people. I hate naming, I always forget. And of course, the wonderful Teresa Mazza and Kapak Choki, and even more than my humble team at the CBD, we have the Forest Peoples program that has driven all of this. So I can't thank you all enough. these are the kinds of webinars that make me want to go to webinars because they're important and they're real and they count. But of course, it's my job to wish you a good evening, a good morning, or a good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. And as I declare this closed, I also want to encourage you to continue to follow the development and the negotiation of the Global Biodiversity Framework so that your voices are heard and so that local and collective actions are valued in the global framework. And with that, I declare this event closed. Have a good day, everyone. Good night.